Picture a continent, the richest continent on Earth, not rich in potential, not rich in promise. Rich right now, today, in the ground beneath its people's feet. It holds 30% of the world's entire mineral reserves, 60% of the world's uncultivated arable land, 10% of global oil reserves. It sits on deposits of gold, platinum, diamonds, cobalt, lithium, uranium, and manganese so vast that the countries above them should be among the wealthiest nations in human history. Now, picture the people living on top of all of that, 600 million, without reliable access to electricity. 400 million going to bed hungry every night. Average income in Sub-Saharan Africa hovering around $2 a day. Infrastructure so underdeveloped that it costs more to ship goods within the continent than to ship them to Europe. Hospitals without medicine. Schools without teachers. Governments without budgets. How does that happen? How does the richest piece of real estate on the planet produce the poorest population on the planet? How does a continent that exports billions of dollars worth of raw materials every single year end up deeper in debt every single year? The answer is not lazy governments. It is not a lack of natural intelligence or work ethic. It is not bad luck or bad geography. The answer is a system, a deliberately engineered, meticulously maintained system of financial extraction that has been operating for 6 decades under the respectable cover of international development assistance. And at the center of that system sits an institution with a modest name, a Washington, D.C. address, and a balance sheet that has done more damage to more people than almost any military force in modern history. It is called the International Monetary Fund. And what it did to Africa is not a conspiracy theory. It is documented, studied, acknowledged, in some cases even apologized for. But the apologies came after the damage, after the hospitals closed, after the factories shut down, after a generation of Africans grew up in economies deliberately designed to serve creditors in New York and Paris rather than citizens in Nairobi and Lagos. Today, we are going to follow the money. We are going to trace the full architecture of the greatest financial scam of the 20th century, from the secret rooms of Bretton Woods to the structural adjustment programs that gutted African economies to the CFA Franc system that means 14 African nations still have their currency printed in France today. This is not ancient history. The system is still running. The debt is still compounding. And understanding it is the first step towards something the system has always feared most, an informed audience that refuses to look away. Buckle up. This one is going to make you angry. Let's start with a number that should be impossible. According to research by Global Financial Integrity and several major universities, Africa loses somewhere between $50 billion and $80 billion every single year to illicit financial flows, money that leaves the continent through tax evasion, trade mispricing, corrupt transfers, and debt service payments to foreign creditors. For context, that number is larger than the total foreign aid Africa receives annually, which means the continent is a net exporter of wealth to the rest of the world. Every year, the aid flows in one direction for cameras. The real money flows in the other direction, in the dark. But to understand how this happened, we have to go back to the moment when it seemed like everything was about to change for the better, the 1960s, the decade of African independence. Between 1960 and 1975, 40 African nations gained formal independence from their European colonial masters. The flags changed. The anthems changed. The leaders in the presidential palaces changed from white Europeans to black Africans. The crowds in the streets were euphoric. After generations of extraction, humiliation, and enforced underdevelopment, the continent was finally taking control of its own destiny. Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana was talking about Pan-African unity and industrialization. Julius Nyerere in Tanzania was building a vision of African socialism. Patrice Lumumba in the Congo was promising that the vast mineral wealth of his country would finally serve its own people. These were not naive men. They were sophisticated, educated, visionary leaders who understood that political independence without economic independence was just theater. The colonial powers understood this too, which is why they made sure that economic independence never fully arrived. The borders drawn at the Berlin Conference of 1884 stayed in place, splitting ethnic groups, cutting off natural trading partners, creating landlocked nations with no access to the sea. The currencies introduced by colonial administrations remained tied to European monetary systems. The export infrastructure, the ports, the railways, the processing facilities, all pointed outward toward Europe rather than inward toward neighboring African nations. And then, just as Africa was beginning to build, the debt arrived. To understand the IMF, you have to understand where it came from. And it came from the same place as everything else in the post-war financial order. Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, 1944. The same conference that created the petrodollar architecture we covered in an earlier video. The IMF was created with an ostensibly noble purpose: to provide short-term financing to countries experiencing balance of payments crises, to be the global lender of last resort, to stabilize the international monetary system and prevent the kind of competitive currency devaluations and trade wars that had contributed to the Great Depression. Sounds reasonable, even admirable. But here's the critical detail that determines everything about how the institution actually operates. Voting power in the IMF is determined by financial contributions. The more money a country puts in, the more votes it controls. And in 1944, and for the 8 decades since, the United States has been the largest contributor. The U.S. holds veto power over major decisions. The managing director of the IMF has historically always been a European. The chief economist almost always an American or European-trained academic. Africa's combined voting share in the IMF is less than 5%. A continent of 54 nations and 1.4 billion people has less influence over the institution, supposedly designed to help it, than a single European nation. The structure was not designed to serve Africa. It was designed by the people who had just finished extracting wealth from Africa for 3 centuries and had no intention of stopping. This matters enormously because the IMF does not simply lend money. It lends money with conditions. And those conditions are written by people whose primary constituency is not African farmers or African hospital patients. It is Western creditors, Western banks, and Western governments who want to be repaid. The trap was not set all at once. It was set in stages. And the first stage was the 1970s petrodollar flood we have discussed before. After the 1973 oil embargo, OPEC nations were swimming in petrodollars. Those dollars flowed into Western banks, primarily American and European institutions, which now had more money than they could profitably lend in their home markets. They needed borrowers. They needed someone to take the money off their hands and pay interest on it. They found willing takers in Africa. And why not? African nations were newly independent, optimistic, and genuinely in need of capital to build the roads, dams, schools, and industrial facilities that colonialism had deliberately withheld. Western banks sent their representatives to African capitals with briefcases full of loan agreements and very attractive initial interest rates. Citibank, Chase Manhattan, Barclays, they were not offering charity. They were offering product. The loans were syndicated across multiple banks, reducing individual risk while increasing the total volume of credit extended. African governments borrowed enthusiastically. Ghana borrowed to build infrastructure. Zambia borrowed against its copper revenues. Nigeria borrowed against its oil. The assumption embedded in every loan agreement was the same assumption that had been embedded in every property purchase in Tokyo in 1988. The underlying asset, in this case commodity prices, only goes up. Then Paul Volcker happened. In 1979, the Federal Reserve Chairman raised U.S. interest rates to levels not seen in modern economic history. Rates peaked above 20% in 1981. This was done to crush American inflation. It worked, but it had a catastrophic side effect that nobody in Washington spent much time worrying about. The loans that African nations had taken out in the 1970s were denominated in dollars at variable interest rates. When U.S. rates spiked, the interest payments on those loans spiked with them. Overnight, the debt became mathematically impossible to service. Simultaneously, commodity prices collapsed. The copper that Zambia had borrowed against became worth half what it had been. The oil that Nigeria had borrowed against dropped. The terms of trade moved viciously against every African borrower. At exactly the moment their interest payments were doubling, the trap had been sprung. Not through malice in every individual case, but through a system structured so that the risks fell entirely on the borrower and the rewards flowed entirely to the lender. Africa was holding the bag. The IMF was about to offer to help carry it. By the early 1980s, country after country across Africa was in the same position. Debt payments they could not make. Currencies in freefall. Governments unable to fund basic services. The IMF and its sister institution, the World Bank, arrived with what they called structural adjustment programs. SAPs, the rescue package. The conditions attached to these rescue packages were presented as economic common sense. If your country is in financial trouble, you need to cut spending, liberalize your markets, let the private sector lead, and integrate into the global economy. This is what the IMF called the Washington Consensus. And for the countries that accepted it, it was an economic catastrophe disguised as a prescription. Let's go through conditions one by one, because each one deserves your full attention. Condition 1. Cut government spending. Specifically, reduce subsidies on food, fuel, and agriculture. In wealthy countries, this is politically painful but survivable. In African countries where subsistence farming was a primary livelihood and urban populations depended on subsidized staple foods to survive, cutting these subsidies meant starvation, not metaphorically, literally. Food riots erupted across the continent. In Zambia in 1991, in Nigeria in 1989, in Tunisia in 1984. People died in the streets protesting the removal of food subsidies that the IMF had demanded as a condition of its loans. Condition 2. Privatize state enterprises. African governments were told to sell off their state-owned companies to the private sector. Water utilities, power companies, mining operations, telecommunications. The theory was that private ownership would make these more efficient. The reality was that foreign corporations, primarily European and American, acquired African assets at fire sale prices during economic crises, and then extracted profits from captive populations who had no alternatives. When a private company owns the only water system in a city and answers to shareholders rather than citizens, water bills go up and service quality goes down. This happened everywhere. Condition 3. Remove trade barriers. African governments were told to open their markets to foreign competition by eliminating tariffs and import protections. The theory was comparative advantage. Specialize in what you do best. Trade for everything else. The reality was that African infant industries, companies that had been established with government support and were beginning to develop, were suddenly competing against heavily subsidized European and American producers. French farmers, subsidized by the EU's Common Agricultural Policy, could sell chicken in Ghana for less than Ghanaian farmers could produce it. The Ghanaian chicken industry collapsed. The same pattern repeated across sector after sector across the continent. Condition 4. Devalue the currency. African currencies were consistently overvalued according to IMF economists, which made imports cheap and exports expensive. Devaluation would make exports more competitive. In theory, correct. In practice, devaluation made imported goods, including medicine, fuel, machinery, and food that countries could no longer produce themselves after their agricultural sectors were destroyed, dramatically more expensive. The people who suffer were not the elites who held dollar accounts. They were the ordinary citizens whose wages and savings were denominated in the local currency that had just been cut in half. Condition 5. Raise interest rates. This was supposed to attract foreign capital and control inflation. What it actually did was make it impossible for African businesses to borrow and invest. When interest rates are 20%, 30%, even 40% as they were in some adjustment countries, no domestic entrepreneur can afford credit. The only entities that can borrow at those rates are governments, which are borrowing to pay the IMF back, and large foreign corporations with access to cheaper capital elsewhere. The overall effect of these 5 conditions, applied simultaneously to economies already in crisis, was to structurally lock African nations into a role of raw material exporter and captive consumer market for manufactured goods. You were not allowed to protect your industries. You were not allowed to subsidize your farmers. You were not allowed to control your currency. You were not allowed to spend on your own people. But you were absolutely required to keep servicing your debt to foreign creditors. That was the one condition that was never adjusted. Numbers are important, but the numbers only matter because of what they represent in human lives. Let me take you inside 3 countries. Ghana was one of the first African nations to achieve independence in 1957 under Kwame Nkrumah. It had real infrastructure, a functioning civil service, and genuine development ambitions. By the early 1980s, after a series of coups, mismanagement, and a debt crisis, it was in desperate shape. In 1983, Ghana signed a structural adjustment agreement with the IMF. What followed was a textbook demonstration of SAP consequences. The cedi was devalued repeatedly. State enterprises were privatized. Trade barriers were removed. The cocoa sector, Ghana's primary export earner, was liberalized. For a brief period, economic indicators improved. GDP growth returned. Inflation fell. The IMF declared Ghana a success story. But look beneath the surface. Manufacturing employment collapsed as local industries were undercut by imports. Income inequality widened dramatically. The gains from growth went to those connected to export agriculture and foreign capital. The rural poor saw a little benefit, and the structural vulnerability, complete dependence on commodity prices and foreign capital flows, remained untouched. Zambia's story is darker. Zambia built its post-independence economy around copper. When copper prices were high, life was genuinely good. Education and health indicators in the 1970s were among the best in Sub-Saharan Africa. Then the copper price collapsed, the interest rate shock hit, and Zambia was forced into IMF adjustment. The results were devastating. The privatization of the copper mines handed the country's primary asset to foreign corporations. Spending cuts gutted the health system that had been one of Zambia's genuine achievements. By the mid-1990s, life expectancy in Zambia had actually fallen from its 1970s peak. A country that had been moving forward was moving backward, and it was paying interest to foreign creditors the entire time. Nigeria is perhaps the most instructive case because of the sheer scale of the paradox. Nigeria has oil, enormous oil reserves. It should be one of the wealthiest nations on earth. Instead, the combination of Dutch disease from oil dependence, structural adjustment programs that destroyed non-oil sectors, and the debt service obligations that consumed government revenue created a situation where a country pumping millions of barrels of oil per day had hospitals without basic supplies, roads that hadn't been maintained in decades, and a population where over 40% lived below the poverty line. The oil wealth flows up and out. The poverty stays. Here is a statistic that makes the entire development aid narrative collapse. For every dollar that flows into Africa in the form of foreign aid, roughly $7 flow out in debt service payments, tax evasion by multinational corporations, trade mispricing, and illicit financial transfers. Let me say that again. For every dollar in, $7 out. The mechanism of transfer pricing deserves particular attention because it is legal, sophisticated, and almost invisible. When a multinational corporation operates in an African country, it often structures its operations through a complex network of subsidiaries in tax havens. The African subsidiary sells its products to a related company in, say, the Cayman Islands at an artificially low price, thereby minimizing taxable profit in Africa. The related company then sells at market price to the final customer, booking the profit in a jurisdiction with a 0% corporate tax rate. The African country gets the environmental cost of extraction. It gets the labor. It gets the infrastructure where. What it doesn't get is the tax revenue that would allow it to build schools and hospitals and roads. According to the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, multinational corporations underpay African governments by approximately $50 billion per year through transfer pricing alone. Every year. That is more than the total annual health budget of every African country combined. And who enforces the rules on transfer pricing? Who sets the international tax standards? The OECD, a club of rich countries. The same countries whose corporations are doing the mispricing. The people setting the rules are the people benefiting from the rules. This is not a coincidence. We touched on this in our petrodollar video. But it deserves its own examination because it is one of the most audacious ongoing financial extractions in modern history. And almost nobody in the West knows it exists. The CFA franc is a currency used by 14 African countries, all of them former French colonies. The West African CFA franc covers 8 countries, including Senegal, Ivory Coast, and Mali. The Central African CFA franc covers 6 countries, including Cameroon and Gabon. Together, these 14 nations represent roughly 180 million people. Here is how the system works. The CFA franc is pegged to the euro at a fixed exchange rate guaranteed by the French Treasury. In exchange for this guarantee, the 14 nations are required to deposit 50% of their foreign exchange reserves into a special account at the French Treasury in Paris. Until 2005, the requirement was 65%. France earns interest on these deposits and effectively has free use of a significant portion of West and Central Africa's foreign exchange reserves. The currency cannot be devalued without French permission. Monetary policy is set not by African central banks acting in the interests of African economies, but by an arrangement that prioritizes the fixed peg to euro, which serves French economic interests. Countries experiencing economic shocks cannot use exchange rate adjustment as a policy tool. They are locked into a monetary straitjacket designed in Paris. When a Senegalese government wants to expand spending to build schools or hire teachers, the CFA system constrains its ability to do so. When Ivory Coast, the world's largest cocoa producer, wants to industrialize and add value to its cocoa before export, the CFA system makes it difficult to use exchange rate policy to support infant industries. The raw beans leave. The chocolate is made in Switzerland and Belgium. The profit stays in Europe. There have been brave attempts to change this. Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary leader of Burkina Faso in the 1980s, railed against the CFA system and the entire architecture of African dependence on former colonial powers. He reduced his own salary, refused foreign aid, and tried to build a self-sufficient economy. He was assassinated in 1987. His successor immediately restored relations with France and the IMF. Whether that is a coincidence is left as an exercise for the viewer. In 2019, there was a reformulation announced. The West African CFA franc was to be rebranded as the ECO, with a gradual reduction of the reserve requirement. But as of today, the fundamental architecture of the system, the fixed peg, the French Treasury guarantee, the monetary constraints, remains largely intact. The name changed. The chains did not. Just as the IMF structural adjustment era was being widely discredited, a new player arrived in Africa with a different offer. China. Unlike the IMF, China did not attach political conditions to its loans. No demands for privatization, no requirements to remove trade barriers, no lectures about governance and democracy. China offered infrastructure, roads, railways, ports, dams, and financed them with loans tied to Chinese construction companies and Chinese workers. The Belt and Road Initiative poured hundreds of billions of dollars into African infrastructure from the mid-2000s onward, and for a moment it genuinely looked like a viable alternative to Western financial domination. African leaders welcomed it enthusiastically, even those who were skeptical of Western intentions. But look at what has happened a decade in. Zambia, which borrowed heavily from Chinese lenders, defaulted on its debt in 2020. Ethiopia, which borrowed massively for its railway and industrial park ambitions, is struggling under a debt burden that consumes a significant share of export revenues. The terms of Chinese loans, often at higher interest rates than concessional Western lending with shorter repayment periods and collateral clauses that have raised concerns about asset seizure, are now generating the same debt service problems that the IMF loans created a generation ago. The specific details differ. China is not imposing the same ideological conditions as the Washington Consensus. But the structural outcome, African nations borrowing in foreign currencies against future commodity revenues to build infrastructure that serves export corridors rather than domestic integration, looks uncomfortably familiar. The pattern endures because the underlying dynamic has not changed. Africa has the resources. The rest of the world wants the resources. The financing is structured so that the risk falls on Africa and the return flows outward. Whether the creditor speaks English with an American accent or Mandarin with a Beijing accent, the mathematics of extraction remain the same. This is a part where I could tell you there is no hope, that the system is too entrenched, too powerful, too deeply embedded to be changed. But that would be both dishonest and irresponsible, because there are examples on this continent of countries that found paths that worked, partially, imperfectly, but genuinely. Botswana. When Botswana gained independence in 1966, it was one of the poorest countries on earth. 3 years later, diamonds were discovered. Every structural adjustment script would predict that Botswana will become another resource curse story. Instead, the government negotiated hard with De Beers, eventually securing a 50-50 joint venture in which diamond revenues were channeled into a sovereign wealth fund and invested in education, healthcare, and infrastructure. Botswana's per capita income today is among the highest in Sub-Saharan Africa. The diamond wealth was not perfectly distributed, and the country faces its own challenges. But the fundamental decision to retain control of the resource revenue and invest it domestically made an enormous difference. Rwanda. In 1994, Rwanda was the site of one of the worst genocides of the 20th century. 1 million people killed in 100 days. The country was physically and psychologically destroyed. 30 years later, Rwanda is one of the fastest growing and best governed economies in Africa, not because of IMF programs, because of a government that made strategic decisions about which foreign investment to accept and on what terms, invested heavily in technology and services, and built institutions that function. It is not a perfect country, but its trajectory demonstrates that the resource curse and the debt trap are not destiny. They are policy choices. And at the continental level, the conversation is finally shifting. The African Continental Free Trade Area, signed by 54 nations, is the most ambitious attempt in history to create the kind of integrated continental market that would allow African economies to trade with each other, add value to their raw materials domestically, and reduce dependence on external financing for growth. If it is fully implemented, the internal African market becomes large enough to sustain domestic industrial development in ways that were impossible when each country was negotiating individually with vastly more powerful external partners. The CFA Franc debate is growing louder. More African economists and policymakers are openly questioning a system that their predecessors accepted as given. Nigeria and South Africa, the two largest African economies, have never been part of the CFA zone and have maintained monetary sovereignty. Their economies have their own deep problems, but they demonstrate that independence from the French monetary system is survivable. The $1 trillion that has flowed out of Africa in documented illicit financial flows over the past 2 decades has not disappeared into the void. It sits in private banks in Switzerland, the Cayman Islands, and Delaware. Changing the international tax rules to prevent this extraction, closing the loopholes that multinational corporations exploit, taxing wealth that has been hidden in jurisdictions that benefit from secrecy while Africa bears the costs. These are achievable policy goals. They require political will from wealthy countries that profit from the current system, but they are not technically impossible. The International Monetary Fund has, in its own publications, acknowledged that some of the structural adjustment policies of the 1980s and 1990s had negative consequences. The World Bank has issued similar acknowledgments. Economists who designed the Washington Consensus have, in some cases, expressed regret about how it was applied. These acknowledgments arrived after a generation of Africans grew up in economies that had been surgically restructured to serve creditors rather than citizens. The apologies do not rebuild the industries that were destroyed by premature liberalization. They do not restore the health systems gutted by austerity. They do not give back the childhoods of the children who could not attend schools when education budgets were cut to meet debt service requirements. The scam worked so effectively because it was never called a scam. It was called development. It was called structural adjustment. It was called the Washington Consensus. Respectable-sounding phrases that laundered an extraction machine to the language of expertise and benevolent intervention. And here's the thing that should stay with you after this video. The system is still running. African nations are still borrowing from the IMF and World Bank. The CFA franc is still being printed in France. The tax loopholes that drain $50 billion a year from the continent are still open. The debt is still compounding. The wealth is still flowing out. Understanding what happened and how it was engineered is the minimum requirement for changing it, because you cannot fix a machine you do not understand, and you cannot demand accountability from institutions whose operations you do not know exist. The $1 trillion that has been extracted from the richest continent on Earth did not go to waste. It built financial districts in London. It funded universities in Paris. It sits in trust funds and private equity portfolios in New York. It became the comfortable world that wealthy countries take for granted. build on a foundation that most of their citizens have never been asked to examine. Now you have examined it. What you do with that knowledge is up to you. If this video opened your eyes to something the mainstream won't cover, hit the like button. The algorithm buries this kind of content, and your engagement is the only thing that gets it to the people who need to hear it. Subscribe if you want to keep following the money wherever it leads. And tell me in the comments, did you know about the CFA franc before this video? I want to know, because in my experience, almost nobody outside West Africa does. And that invisibility is exactly how the system survives. Stay skeptical, stay informed, and keep watching.